Welcome to the Encyclopedia of Catholic Theology podcast. I'm Gideon Barr, the Executive Director of the Encyclopedia of Catholic Theology, and I'm here today with Father Dylan Schrader, who has written for us a wonderful entry on theological notes and censures. So, Father Schrader, welcome to Cape Girardeau.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
So we've made a lot of progress on recording some other things about theological notes and censors, but I think we want to just kind of sit down and have a casual conversation today about the man who wrote the article. So maybe just give people a just very brief kind of top line introduction to who you are.
Sure. Well, I'm a priest of the Diocese of Jefferson City in Missouri. I was raised in Hannibal, Missouri. Studied at Conception Seminary College. Actually, before that, studied at the high school seminary there in Hannibal at St. Thomas Aquinas. And then after Conception, went on to Kenrick in St. Louis. I've served as a parish priest in a variety of assignments in our diocese. Studied theology at Catholic University. And currently I'm pastor of St. Joseph in Westphalia and St. Anthony in Folk. Also enjoy writing and talking about theology and Latin and liturgy and all sorts of topics.
Yeah, there's a number of interesting things from your biography that I want to touch on. You are a fellow Missourian, right?
Yes.
So we're here in Cape Girardeau on the
Yes.
Mississippi River, and I was just remarking that a number of our guests, when they come, they want to make their way down to the river and to kind of see it and get that sort of Mississippi River town feel. But that is not unknown to you. You have no need to do that while you're here because you grew up in Hannibal, Missouri. And when I tell people when they come to Cape Girardeau, they're like, "Is Cape Girardeau on the Mississippi River?" I say, "Yes." So, and I said, "Just think kind of like Mark Twain territory." And but you are really in Mark. So tell us a little bit about your upbringing in Hannibal.
Yeah, so I love Hannibal. Beautiful, beautiful small town. And for me, the memories of my childhood are filled with the river, the railroad tracks, the woods and the fields, the little neighborhoods, the little downtown area, all that kind of stuff. Actually, I recently reread The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn for the first time in many years because, as a Hannibalian, you kind of grew up on those things. So I went back and reread those just this last year, and just was once again struck at really the wit and the brilliance of Mark Twain's prose. But it's just kind of part of life there in Hannibal. You go to the cave, you go to the museums. It's kind of small town America. Hannibal's called America's hometown.
Oh, interesting.
And that's always what it felt like to me. It's my hometown,
Right.
but it's got that kind of nice small Missouri town atmosphere, and so it's very familiar to me.
Now, I assume from some of the other things you mentioned that you grew up Catholic. Tell us a little bit about your early life and kind of early life of faith.
Yeah, so I grew up Catholic in one sense. My family was not always very strongly practicing when I was younger. There was some tension there. My parents came from different religious backgrounds. So my mom was Catholic. My dad was Buddhist for a long time.
Oh,
But they got along fine, both very good people and everything like that.
okay.
But religion was kind of this not malicious, but kind of this just division. There was just a difference there, And so when I was younger, my mom would go to mass or go to church, but like my brother and I maybe would not, or we would sometimes go with my dad to meditation services, or sometimes we'd go to Unitarian services, or we'd sometimes go to mass or whatever. So it was a little bit all over the place. But as I got to be closer to the age of about 10 or 11, I began to really think about these things more seriously and to kind of realize that, if any of this religion stuff is true, then it's really important. And it was a process. I remember one of the things was that I had a copy of the Bible. And so I read the Gospels. I read from the Gospels, and I was struck by the person of Jesus, and just the way that Jesus would talk and the things that he would say, and just the sense that what he was telling his disciples and telling people sort of came from this other world, and it just seemed something more than merely human was in there. And I still wasn't convinced by it or didn't know a lot about it, and I was a child and everything else, but I became more interested in religion and in Christianity. Another thing that happened was that I started to pray the rosary. So I had a rosary that had been given to me for my first communion. And I didn't really know, I didn't really know a lot about it, but I had a little booklet on how to pray the rosary. And I knew that, well, if God is real, then I can talk to God in prayer. And I didn't know how else to pray, really. So I just started praying the rosary. And it was the experience of meditating about the mysteries, the life of Jesus, that sort of began to just give me a sense of like who Jesus was and what he did in his life, and just kind of basic stuff. So a lot of it grew out of there, and I started wanting to learn more explicitly about the faith, and started really seeing the importance of it. And seeing the importance of the sacraments, which is also what got me thinking about the priesthood. To say, okay, well, God is not just like out there somewhere. God actually is coming to us in tangible form through the sacraments. And so maybe God is inviting me to make that a part of my life and to help other people by bringing the sacraments to them. So it was kind of a process of development. So when I was at Conception, actually, my dad became Catholic and was received into the church. And is very devout. So like all my immediate family are very, very devout practicing Catholics now. So that's a great blessing to me.
Yeah, certainly. Father, you might be the youngest priest I've ever met who went to high school seminary. To explain that a little bit.
Well, yeah. So I know it sounds kind of crazy, but especially coming from
this would have been much more common.
Oh yeah,
50 years ago, 60 years ago.
It would have been very common up until the last several decades, but certainly in the United States and in other countries, but in the United States up until the 1960s, 1970s, there were high school seminaries everywhere.
Right.
And I happened, in God's providence, to grow up in a town that had one of the last remaining high school seminaries in the U.S., St. Thomas Aquinas in Hannibal, Missouri.
Interesting.
And so for me, while it was a little intimidating to talk to my parents about, hey, I'm thinking about becoming a priest, especially sort of coming from a not super religious background up until a few years prior to that, and having kind of that conversion experience, at the age of 12, 13 and so forth, to be thinking about the priesthood and to like have the courage to have that conversation. But even with that, it didn't seem like that big a deal to me, because I grew up just knowing that the seminary was there.
Right.
And so it just seemed like a normal, viable option. It didn't seem like I was going off to some distant land to do some kind of unusual thing. I really didn't know that they weren't common at all, because it was always in the background. It was always, well, guys who are in high school who are thinking about the priesthood, this is where they go. And I thought, so when I was 13, or really when I was 14, and I was thinking, I'm interested in the priesthood. I thought, well, that's where you go. So that's where I went. And it was a great experience. We had such a good school. We had, priests on the faculty there. We had a good camaraderie, good environment. It's very non-threatening. When you start off in the seminary at that level, you're not locked into anything. It's totally normal for guys to go and sort of think about the priesthood. You're sort of, beginning to try it out, but it's normal to come and go and sometimes come back or do something else with your life or whatever it is. But, for me, it was a really supportive environment. And I really don't know how well my faith would have survived if I had not had that kind of structure. Because getting into, like, actually going to a Catholic school, so I had never gone to Catholic school before, so actually going to a Catholic school, having a day with daily mass, with lauds and vespers, with the rosary, structured prayer, and being surrounded by other guys my own age who were interested in the faith and who were thinking about the priesthood, but who were practicing Catholics. It was a great support to me. And so I made some friends there that are still friends of mine today. And yeah, I really don't know whether my vocation or whether even my faith would have survived without that kind of environment. For other people, it probably would have, but I was in kind of a delicate situation, and I think I really needed that structure. So it was a great blessing to just grow up in a town that happened to have this resource right there where I could just go there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing. It certainly had to be one of the last remaining high school seminaries. From there, you went to Conception Seminary College, which for our listeners is a Benedictine abbey and seminary in Northwest Missouri. Tell us a little bit about that experience. It's familiar to me because I know other men who've gone there, but maybe tell people a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Conception is a beautiful monastery, Benedictine. It's in Conception, Missouri. It's vaguely near Maryville or St. Joseph, Missouri. It's sort of in that area, but it's out there. Today there are windmills. There are windmills everywhere. When I was there weren't windmills, but now if you go out there, and it makes sense because it's a very flat and windy area.
Right.
So I'm sure they're drawing a lot of power from those windmills. But I was in the last class to graduate from St. Thomas in 2002, and then actually graduated a year early because that was in the year where the seminary closed, the high school seminary closed.
Okay.
So it was kind of a quick and rough transition in one sense, that I was expecting to do another year at St. Thomas and then eventually go on to Conception, but we moved that up a year because the school was closing and everything. So I was very grateful that I didn't have to spend a year out of the seminary, kind of being thrown into a different environment and then being thrown back in. So it was great that we had enough credits to graduate. We were able to just kind of go right into Conception. And it was a different environment. But one thing I really, really enjoyed was our proximity to the monastery. And seeing the monks living the rule of St. Benedict. And one of the things that I did my first year there was to read the rule of St. Benedict, and of course, how can you not in an environment like that? But then you see people actually living this out, like, the bells ring for whatever hour of the divine office, and they stop whatever they're doing, and they go to the basilica and chant the divine office for that hour. And, they each have their own task that they're assigned to, that the abbot assigns them to, and that's their work. So they work and they pray. And it was great to kind of just be in that environment. So, naturally in a place like that, you start thinking, well, okay, I'm interested in the priesthood, but, maybe I should be interested in the religious life.
Right.
And so the Benedictines, I always had great admiration for them, their dedication to the work of God, dedication to community life and things like that. Also have great admiration for the Carmelites, kind of their ancient spirituality and their combination of the active and contemplative lives. Great admiration for the Dominicans and their apostolic zeal for sharing the faith with others and teaching the faith and bringing it to people. But in the end, I decided to become a diocesan priest. So just kind of what I had grown up with, the normal priesthood in normal parish life.
Right. So from there, you went to Kenneth Glennon Seminary in St. Louis, and you were ordained in 2010. 2010. Okay. So after your ordination, you did some work in parishes, but then you were sent for further study to get a doctorate at the Catholic University of America.
Yes.
So tell us about CUA, your experience there, and what you decided to do your doctoral research on.
Well, I had a great experience at Catholic University. Also, I should say at Kenrick, too. So Kenrick in St. Louis, made some lifelong friends there. Great environment. I really feel that I was there in a golden age in a lot of ways. Excellent classes, excellent formation, really good support.
Was Larry Feingold on the faculty yet when you were there?
Not yet. Not yet.
Okay.
But we knew him, though.
Yeah.
A lot of us knew him. And so he was just kind of on the way in.
Right.
But I never studied with him, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Although I've read many of his books.
Would have been a great
and listened to
blessing,
many
I'm
of his
sure.
talks.
Yeah.
And he's a very kind and just generous man with the gifts that he's received. He's shared those and is helping the church very much. So we were there it was a great time. And so following that, of course, I'm ordained. I've served in a variety of parishes. After about 5 years of ordination, I was very generously given the opportunity to go and study at Catholic University, and where I did my doctorate in systematic theology, and that was a great experience. So it was a little hard to adjust to going back into school
Right.
after being out, and after being in a parish after running your own parishes, for a while, to go back into the mode of being a student. I will say it's a lot less stressful being a student than it is being pastor of a parish, which I know graduate students may not believe me on that, but that was my experience anyway. Now, of course, I don't have a family to provide for, things like that, so I don't have to worry about that. But it was kind of a weird experience to go back to devoting myself to more speculative matters. And actually, I'll be honest, it was a little difficult because as a parish priest, your sense of identity and mission is so tied up in helping other people. You're always thinking about the needs of people in your community, and you're always trying to follow up with that person or reach out to that person or respond to a crisis with that person or whatever it is. And so to let go of all that responsibility and now to try to remember, okay, my responsibility is to study hard and to learn the material and to think through things. I had to deal with the fact that, wow, it really feels like on a daily basis I'm not helping anybody.
Right.
It was very difficult. Like I'm saying mass for people, I'm hearing confessions, but I always felt like I wanted to be doing more. But I just had to remind myself at this time, the diocese is asking me to study, and that's what I need to do. So, but that was only for a few years. And once I had finished that, I was back in parish work again. And then I had to transition back to responsibility for parishes and things like that.
Okay.
So I did my doctoral dissertation on the motive of the Incarnation, specifically arguing for and kind of historically exploring and explaining the view of the Carmelites of Salamanca, the Salamanticenses, which is a view within the Thomistic tradition. It's not the hardline Thomistic view, but I think it is the view that more fruitfully explores different strands within the thought of St. Thomas and within the Catholic tradition as a whole. So
let's take a second and maybe kind of set the stage for that and linger on that kind of speculative issue for a minute. So the motive of the Incarnation. So we're asking the question there, why did God become man? Right? And maybe just spell out for us, what is the kind of traditional Thomistic or hardline view?
Yeah, so the question of the motive of the Incarnation, the first thing to know is that motive here doesn't literally mean, in a univocal sense, something that causes God to act, right? Because, of course, God is the first cause. So when we discuss the motive of the Incarnation, we're using the term motive analogously to how we would talk about human decision-making. God doesn't go through a decision-making process.
Right.
He's not looking to something outside of himself that he's reacting to. So we're using all these terms analogously. So the motive of the Incarnation is one of the ways of framing a question, which is essentially what you said. Why did God become man, right? The reality is that there are different things that God accomplishes by becoming man. So he sets an example for us, right? Christ sets an example for us. He elevates the dignity of human nature by uniting it to divine person. He saves us from our sins by accomplishing the work of the redemption, right? He reveals God to us. So by becoming human, God discloses himself to us. So all these things are parts of the answer.
Reveals the Trinity.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's when we approach this whole question, what the question became classically is, well, what's the sine qua non condition? So one of the ways in which it gets framed is hypothetical. Would God have become incarnate if there had been no sin? Because sin is really the crux for a lot of people.
It was a creed for us men and for our salvation, right?
Yeah, and the creed we say, for us men and for our salvation, he came down from heaven. So there's, broadly speaking, the two basic answers you can give to a hypothetical question that's framed in that way. Either God would have become incarnate if there had been no sin, that is, regardless of sin, God would have become man, or he would not have. Already, when you frame it that way, you have to be clear that what you're talking about is looking at the actual decision God has made and how do we understand what are the motivating factors, so to speak, within that decision. So I'll give you an example. Let's say that I'm going to do some errands today. So I'm going to go to the grocery store, and I'm going to go to the clothing store, and I'm going to go to the shoe store. Okay. And I'm going to buy food, I'm going to buy a shirt, and I'm going to buy some shoes. Okay. I'm going to do all those things, just like the incarnation accomplishes many things. But you can ask the question, would I still go out and do these errands if the shoe store is closed? So is the shoe store, is my ability to buy shoes a decisive factor or not? Or would I go to the other places anyway, even if I don't need shoes?
Right.
Or would I only go if the shoe store happens to be open? So is God's addressing the problem of human sin a decisive factor for the incarnation or not?
You're asking me?
That's the background.
Okay.
That's the question.
That's the question.
And there are different answers. So Duns Scotus famously says that more likely God would have become incarnate regardless of sin. St. Thomas famously says that based on what God has revealed to us, the answer seems to be that God would probably not have become incarnate if there had been no sin.
Right.
Not that he couldn't have, but that the decision he actually made, as it's revealed to us in sacred scripture, and we only know God's free decisions based on what he tells us about them, seems to be that God is addressing human sin, and that that's a sine qua non condition for God's becoming human.
Right. And now enter, you mentioned Aquinas, you mentioned Scotus, now enter the Carmelites. Maybe say a word about who they are, the Carmelites of Salamanca.
The Carmelites of Salamanca are, when we say that, we're talking specifically about those who were there in the 17th century, and specifically about a group of 5 people, really 1 or 2 people who wrote the bulk of a course of theology. But it was finished out by some others after them. So it's really 3 generations of Discalced Carmelites at the University of Salamanca who are writing a major course of theology, which is thousands of pages, and I would suggest is the greatest work of Thomistic theology of that century.
Now, forgive my ignorance here, Father, but is this a kind of commentary on the Summa, or is this a standalone treatise?
It's a commentary on the Summa, but that doesn't really do justice to the enormity of the work.
Okay.
So it's a commentary on the Summa, but you don't want to think about it as the Summa with just some marginal notes. It's more like taking the structure of the Summa and very broadly using that to jump into all sorts of other topics in great depth.
Sure.
So they are not brief. They are exhaustive in their treatment of their own position, the position of their predecessors and contemporaries, and they go into things at great length. So I'm a great admirer of them, and they're very faithful students of St. Thomas. So they know the works of St. Thomas, the thought of St. Thomas, very thoroughly. So that's what I admire about them.
Excellent. And they have a kind of creative solution or creative position relative to this?
Yes, they're drawing on a couple of Thomists who came before them, and they're also drawing on the Scotistic tradition. But I think they're really articulating the best approach to the question of the motive of the Incarnation. So they're drawing on Pedro de Godoy, Jean-Baptiste Gonnet, but they're much more refined in their answer. So what they're doing is essentially saying that the Thomistic thesis is correct, that God likely would not have become incarnate had there been no sin. Based on what we know from divine revelation, that seems to be correct. So what St. Thomas says is totally accurate and true. However, at the same time, that does not mean that Christ, who is God and man, is somehow secondary in God's intention. So what the Scotistic tradition wants to emphasize, and which is valuable, is the primacy of Christ in God's intention. That God is intending Christ first because he is most excellent, and then everything else for his sake. The scripture also tells us everything was made for the sake of Christ. So the Salmanticenses give us a way of holding both of those things together. Why? How? Because what God intends first is precisely Christ the Redeemer. So by intending Christ as Redeemer, as the first of all his other works, God therefore permits sin. And by permitting sin, foresees that sin will actually occur. And so Christ is being intended as primary, as first in God's, among God, all God's other works, but not independently. So one way to think about this is you don't have a redeemer without someone being redeemed. You don't have a king without a kingdom. You know, you don't have a head without a body. And so Christ, by being intended first, is not being intended apart from everything else, but everything else is being intended along with him. And so in this is included the permission of sin. And so in that way, both what St. Thomas says is correct, and the best of the Scotistic tradition, the primacy of Christ, is also correct. And it's being wrapped up together in this kind of nice package.
Wow, fascinating. So, Father Schrader, in addition to your doctoral work on the motive of the Incarnation, you also have a great love for the Latin language and a certain facility and expertise in that. So, tell us how that developed in you, and what kind of projects or things you're working on relative to the language of the Church.
Yeah, so I studied Latin in high school.
Okay.
And really fell in love with it. Continued to study it in college and then in theology school. And then got involved with the Veterum Sapientia Institute, which does living Latin, spoken Latin. So we were getting ready to do our, I think, 14th summer workshop. And I've been to every one of them.
Are you an instructor in this?
Yeah. So we do a week where we speak entirely in Latin, and we study Latin from every age of the Church. So we look at the Bible, the Sacred Liturgy, the Church Fathers, the medieval period, which is kind of my area, the Roman Curia today, and all sorts of things. So it's a great environment. And I found that by doing the living spoken approach, you learn really quickly. And it really activates knowledge that you have, which makes it much easier to read. So Latin, to me, is important because the sources that I use in theology are largely written in Latin. And it's not the only language in which theology is done by any means, but when you're doing scholastic theology in the medieval and early modern period, you're drawing on those sources, that's in Latin. And so it's a great advantage to be able to read those things more fluently and to engage with those kind of things. So it's tremendously important. I think Latin is important for the Church today because we are a worldwide church. And so when people are analyzing and discussing church documents down to a single phrase or a single word, you need to have a standard text. You need to have a text that we're all talking about. And we're also an ancient and an everlasting church. So the church is very old, and the church is going to be here as long as the world is here. So the stuff that we're writing and talking about today, how is it connected to what was discussed in the past? And how will it be for Catholics in 1,000 years or 2,000 years from now? A language that spans the whole world and spans the past and the future is an extremely valuable thing for the Church. And it's not that Latin is a magical language or that it's somehow different from other languages, but it is in fact the language in which the majority of Catholic thought in the West has been expressed over the centuries. So it remains important for us.
Two things interesting about this to me. So maybe explain to people the Veterum Sapientiae. Where does that name come from?
Yeah, Veterum Sapientiae was an apostolic constitution issued by St. John the 23rd in 1962. So shortly before the Second Vatican Council actually got started, but well after it had been underway in terms of planning,
Right.
on the Feast of the Chair of St. Peter, February 22nd, in St. Peter's Basilica, in a gathering of cardinals, of bishops, of members of the clergy and the faithful, and of all the people in charge of the preparations for Vatican II, who were deliberately invited there, Pope John the 23rd promulgated an apostolic constitution on the promotion of the Latin and Greek languages, calling for the extensive teaching of Latin in seminaries and universities, and for teaching theology and philosophy in Latin, using textbooks in Latin, and for the Congregation for Catholic Education to develop a curriculum for this, which they later did. And he signed this document in front of the high altar of St. Peter's Basilica. So he saw the need for the recovery or revival of Latin. The Veterum Sapientiae Institute at veterumsapientia.org takes its name from that apostolic constitution. And we see our mission as very much, in whatever modest way we can, trying to promote the vision that John the 23rd had.
Right.
So to make Latin an accessible language that is something Catholics can learn today, not just clergy, but high school students, middle school students, homeschoolers, Catholics who are just interested. We use modern language methods. So we look at what is the most effective way for most normal people to learn foreign languages, and we apply that to Latin today.
Okay. Wow. The other thing that strikes me about this, and we could go into much greater detail about all these things, but just in recent days, it seems that Pope Leo XIV is quite adept at his Latin. People have noticed that his pronunciation is very good and that kind of thing. What kind of grade would you give him thus far?
Well, the first C is judged by no one.
That's right.
So I can't judge that. I will say, at the Urbi et Orbi blessing that he gave, he seemed quite comfortable with the Latin text. I mean, were it I would be pretty nervous, I think, coming out onto the balcony, having just been elected as the successor of St. Peter in front of the entire world. I don't know that I would be able to string two words together in any language, but he seemed quite comfortable speaking in Italian and in Spanish and in Latin to give his blessing to the world. The announcement of his election, of course, was given in Latin, right, to signify the importance of this event for the entire church, not just for one language group, not just for one country or another country, but to all of us equally. He chanted the Regina Caeli the other day, and very beautifully. He celebrated his first Mass as Pope in Latin with the cardinals. Wow. So, and he seems quite comfortable in that language. So
that's wonderful.
It's very good. Yeah.
Excellent. Just maybe to close things out here, as we're very grateful for this article on theological notes and censures for the Encyclopedia of Catholic Theology, and it's very rich and encourage folks to explore that. But what other projects maybe do you have going personally, or that you're involved with in Catholic theology, or maybe just like what excites you in Catholic theology? What good things happening today? Good things you're involved with?
There is a lot of good stuff happening in theology today. I'm very privileged to be part of the Sacra Doctrina Project, sacradoctrinaproject.org, and it's just an encouraging community of theologians in the United States and elsewhere who are just trying to support one another. We have our conference coming up, which I'll be going to that. I'm excited to be part of that. I hopefully have a few things coming out for publication here in the next year or so. Things are in the process of being edited and things like that. I'm interested in different areas of theology. I would like to write a response article on the motive of the Incarnation to some critiques or questions that have arisen since my book was written. I just haven't gotten around to it yet, but I
You're a busy
promise.
man.
I promise. I have a response in mind to certain very good questions or critiques that were raised following the publication of that book. But someday maybe I'll get that article written. You know, I'm interested in a lot of things, and I find it's hard to find the hours in the day because for me, my full-time work is being a parish priest, and that certainly is full-time work.
Yes.
So that's what I give myself to, and I do this other stuff on the side because I love the depth of our Catholic faith. I love exploring speculative questions. So most of my interest in the world of theology is looking at pushing the speculative envelope in ways that maybe have not been done recently or that are not being thought about. So, for example, I had an article in Lux Veritatis on a speculative question about whether the state of pure nature, if it were lost through sin, could be recovered or not. Right. Things like that. So very hypothetical.
A very interesting question. You also had you do have a kind of interest in pushing the speculative envelope because I know you have another article, maybe in a previous edition of that same journal, on whether the Trinitarian persons are named person analogously or univocally.
Yeah, that's a Nova et Vetera. Yeah.
Oh, was that Nova et Vetera? Okay,
excuse
me. Sorry.
Yeah.
Another interesting speculative question. So yes, you're a clever man and a very good theologian.
Well, thank you. I'm honored. I'm drawing on people much more clever than I, who knew the Bible and the Church Fathers and our tradition very well, and I'm indebted to the thought of many, many other people who have come before me.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you so much, Father. We'll have occasion to talk more about theological notes and censors, but I think it's a great opportunity for folks in our audience to get to know you, your background, and some of the work that you do. So we're grateful, and we'll see everyone next time.